This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Collaborative for Student Success. EWA retains all editorial control over this podcast. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The new academic year is looming, and at EWA Radio, that means it's time for a favorite tradition, back-to-school story ideas for education reporters. In our next episode, you'll hear K-12 ideas from Kaylin Belsha of Chalkbeat. But first, we're looking at colleges and universities, and there's no better source of story ideas than Scott Jaschik, co-founder of Inside Higher Ed. Scott, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily. It's great to be here.
This is a little bittersweet for us. It's your first visit since announcing your retirement this summer from Inside Higher Ed. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the second half of today's conversation. But first, I'd love for you to just jump right in with some story ideas for our reporters.
So, number one would be the affirmative action ruling by the Supreme Court. It's just out at the end of the court's term, and it's a huge, huge decision. The decision was that colleges may not use race alone as a way to admit students. And how this is going to play out, though, is still a little bit unclear. The Education Department yesterday issued guidance on how to deal with some of the issues involved. But the Education Department is still not responding to the questions about whether financial aid is involved. And that is a huge issue for colleges. If it's just admissions, then maybe 100, 200 colleges are affected. If it's financial aid too, a lot more colleges are affected, including community colleges, regional public universities, all kinds of institutions that you don't think of as having competitive admissions, because they don't. And they also could well be affected by those things. Another big question is over how colleges can recruit students. They provided some guidance, but other things they're still waiting on.
You're making a really important distinction that's looming that we're waiting for. The guidance, as you mentioned, came down on August 15th, and now colleges and universities are in sort of this holding pattern, but so also are colleges for their first-year students.
Yes, and they've just got to do their best. I mean, one of the important things is that no one is banned from colleges, from any college. And it's really important to encourage students, all students of every race, to apply right now, because there is uncertainty, but that doesn't mean they can't get in.
I'm really sort of fascinated about this idea about this decision having a much wider impact than just on these elite institutions, because I do think some people have been a little bit offhand or a little dismissive about this case, suggesting that it really wasn't going to be as earth-shattering as it is. But what you're talking about could affect the very backbone of how schools pay for themselves.
If colleges cannot consider race or ethnicity in aid awards, there are a lot of programs that have to change, and they are all over higher education. That's why, before the decision, just about every college had asked the court not to do this, but they did.
This leads into your next story idea, and that is about how legacy admissions may change and attitudes toward that, and also the rules. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. Legacy admissions is giving a preference to the relative, typically the child, but sometimes the grandchild or sibling of an alumnus. And it's been around for a long time. And people didn't used to really question it or think about it. But getting into a top college these days is a competitive business. I mean, competitive admissions means every slot counts and every person is evaluated on their merits, supposedly. But a legacy admit is not totally evaluated on their merits. They have an edge. And what's going on right now, the court decision did not ban legacy admissions. The Ed Department is investigating legacy admissions, but has not yet ruled on it, although they have encouraged colleges to reconsider legacy admissions, but they haven't made colleges do anything. Now, in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, a few colleges did act. Wesleyan University is a very competitive college in Connecticut, acted, and they are no longer going to do legacy admissions. Legacy admissions also is present at a lot of public universities. Virginia Tech eliminated legacy admissions. The University of Virginia changed legacy admissions so that now it's open to anyone who wants to write an essay about their connection to the university. And that connection could be that they are descended from a slave who helped build the University of Virginia. So they've tried to broaden it. I'm not sure that that's going to really work because ultimately, as a public university, the University of Virginia, at least in my opinion, I can have opinions now that I'm retired, I guess, should be the same for a student in Arlington who had no past connection to UVA as somebody who did.
Well, I want to say, first of all, Scott, I don't think being unretired has ever kept you from having an opinion, for which I have to say I'm pretty grateful. Well, a couple of things come to mind. As you said, legacy admissions, not a new idea and certainly not a new story. If folks want to read a good book about this, Daniel Golden's The Price of Admission came out in 2006. He has a newer edition that was recently re-released with some updates, still a very, very good read. And it's worth noting that there was speculation of after the Supreme Court outlawed race-conscious admissions that the next challenge would be to legacy admissions. People were placing bets on how fast that would happen. I thought it would be, maybe a month. It was days. And there's already now been a complaint against Harvard's legacy admissions.
But what hasn't happened is at the very elite levels. The Ivy League, every one of them has legacy admissions. Stanford has legacy admissions. So if one of them should drop it, I suspect the movement will spread. But thus far, they have not.
I do want to point reporters to some interesting trend stories that may be emerging out there, and that is in response to the SCOTUS decision. University of North Carolina announced that it would be offering free in-state tuition to some undergraduates who meet new qualifications if their families earn less than $80,000 annually. That was in direct response to the SCOTUS ruling. And I think asking colleges and universities, okay, you're going to continue to debate, you're going to continue to think about this, but what are you doing right now practically to diversify your freshman class?
Yes. And I mean, with all of these stories on affirmative action, do they have legacy admissions? Why? There's really no reason for colleges that aren't super competitive to have legacy admissions. Some of them do.
What's your next story idea, Scott, for reporters who are hot on the beat?
It's about race relations on campus. Historically, when we've had a Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in the past, and even some prominent appeals court decisions, it has not been good for race relations. And it encourages a lot of racial attacks, attitudes on minority, particularly Black and Latino students, which is very ugly. And it has no real place in American higher education, except it is in American higher education.
I think you're right, Scott, that this question of race relations on campus is not going to go away. And tensions are extraordinarily high in a lot of places. And it's worth reporters asking, what are administrators doing to address some of these issues, to address concerns of faculty, staff, student communities, and especially what's happened with some of the diversity, equity, inclusion officer positions, which were created and in some cases have been eliminated in recent years. In some places, that's because of budget cuts. In others, it was a question simply of optics or concerns about those positions becoming highly politicized.
That's definitely a good story idea.
You also want to talk about budget cuts that colleges are making. And what about all of the COVID money? What budget cuts could they possibly need, Scott? Aren't they flush?
The COVID money is gone, and colleges have a tough time adjusting to change. The COVID money probably kept some colleges alive that wouldn't have been alive. I mean, look, when you're talking about colleges and economics, it's important to specify who you're talking about. There are colleges with $50 billion endowments, and they're doing just fine. Even if they may make cuts, but they are fine. But there are other colleges that are not fine. Some colleges closed this year. They tend to be very small colleges, but even larger public universities like West Virginia University just announced they're cutting every single foreign language major and program. They offered Chinese, Spanish, German, and they're eliminating all of them. And West Virginia University is a flagship in the state. It's a place that people go because it's a flagship. And nationally, that sends a very specific message.
This goes to something I want to talk about, which is the maybe unintended cascade effect that we see when these kinds of cuts happen. These changes are made. You mentioned West Virginia University. So now a student who may have been thinking about applying there is simply going to think about going out of state for school if they already lived in West Virginia, or not putting down roots in West Virginia that may have kept them there for 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and there are lots of places like that. Now, West Virginia University has in the past taken plenty of students who are not West Virginians, in part because West Virginia is a relatively small state and has a bunch of universities. But the effects on other states' admissions and enrollment are huge. And, in higher ed, you've got states like California, where the University of California system primarily admits Californians because there's so many people there. But there are other states where many public universities are really struggling. And how they will come out of this, I don't know.
So if public universities may be facing a financial crunch, that's going to make them do what? Open up the doors a little wider and admit people who may not have gotten in previously who can pay full freight?
Well, that's one thing they could do. Or they could shrink. A lot of universities shrink in their programs when they are in a tough budget times. So it can really go either way.
A good question for a higher ed reporter might be to do an open records request and ask for the last, 5, 6. We're already going into, can you believe this, Scott, the 4th year of the COVID era.
Yeah.
So let's go back 6, 7 years of freshman enrollment. What percentage we're paying full freight versus right now?
It's amazing when you think how long we have been dealing with COVID and its aftermath. And the aftermath is not gone. Even though colleges are back and operating fully, COVID changed them significantly, and we're just going to wait and see.
We're talking with Scott Jaschik, co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, about big stories in the coming academic year for colleges and universities. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on our website and also your favorite podcasting app. You can also join the Collaborative for Student Success this summer on the Route K-12 podcast, where director Jim Cowan travels the country showcasing the way federal recovery funds are reshaping schools. Guests include education commissioners, district superintendents, teachers, parents, and other folks who are helping to shape the future of schools. Listen in to hear insights and information that could help improve education where you live, and hopefully have some fun along the way. Look out for new episodes of the Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Scott, you had one more story on your list. I want to make sure that we get to it, and then I have some questions for you and a couple of story ideas of my own. And I'm going to ask you what that story idea is, and I'm going to hope that you wrote the question yourself.
Well, I did. This is entirely original thought, but it's ChatGPT. And what in the world is it going to do to colleges? And I'm going to say that it's causing a lot of panic this year. People could use ChatGPT to write admissions essays, to write essays for their class, to do any number of things. Presidents could use ChatGPT to write a speech. It's going to be all over. And this year, I think, is going to be a key year for colleges and universities to decide what they want from ChatGPT. Now, in terms of all the hysteria we are seeing about this, I would remind listeners that when Wikipedia started, there was a similar panic. And many, said, oh my gosh, people are going to use it and it's going to be terrible for plagiarism, et cetera, et cetera. And now I think people have accepted that Wikipedia exists and can be useful for some projects even. I think in the next year, we're going to see perhaps an evolution of ChatGPT. There are companies that are trying to offer ChatGPT detectors and other things. Colleges will have various policies, and I think probably a consensus will emerge on where it will be permitted and where it won't.
I find it fascinating. And the thing that concerns me, though, is some of the more immediate solutions to students using ChatGPT in ways that are unethical, including plagiarism, or simply to create something that's not their original work, is the solutions all require a lot of people. So, for example, if you want to make sure students can answer their essay questions, you make them come in and write them the old-fashioned way in a blue book in a proctored exam, and then have a human read those answers and grade them. And all of that is going to require human power and cost for the colleges to sort of set up this gatekeeping.
It will. And, in some ways, I'm not sure that's a terrible thing. To preserve the integrity is essential for higher education. And I don't think proctors and blue books by themselves are a prohibitive expense. Look, making sure everyone has a laptop is an expense. So it sort of goes both ways.
I personally am all for the Blue Book, and there have also been studies that say that actually having to write something out by hand, you remember it in a different way and you process the information differently than you do when you're typing on a keyboard. Of course, now this will have the cascade effect if we'll have to bring back cursive lessons at K-12. And my apologies to Morgan Polikoff at USC. I know he thinks that's going to be a very terrible idea. Scott, I had another story idea that I wanted to run by you, and that is, how can reporters do a thoughtful job looking at what might be an exodus from higher education of professors, instructors, graduate students who simply don't see a future for themselves in that workplace as a whole for many reasons, in some instances, because of the politicization of higher education, and others because of changes in state law restricting academic freedom. My concern is reporters having these very catchy headlines using the word exodus, that it might turn into what we see at the K-12 level, which is a lot of stories about teacher shortages that don't really get to the root of the problem. What advice do you have for higher education reporters who may be looking at that big picture?
Sure. Well, one, we need a lot of great reporting from the reporters who are in the states like Florida and Texas, where this may be happening. And I'd separate out admissions from hiring. In admissions, it's important to remember most people who go to public universities in Florida and Texas are from Florida and Texas. There are some people, they certainly get students who are not, but I think that is the group that will be the most affected. And Florida and Texas both rely on their reputations. They've had great universities to attract out-of-state students. But it really is different this year. Some students have always found it appealing to go to a different part of the country, and they're great universities to go to. But many students, I think what we are seeing, find the prospect of being in a state that basically doesn't allow abortion or doesn't allow it after a very limited time to be a deal breaker for them. And they say they're going to stay away. And you just need to look at the stories. How many have they had from out of state? How many will they have? And not just at the overall figures of the numbers. In terms of faculty and graduate students, the things to watch are, what are the trends in faculty departures? There are some faculty departures every year, so don't be in a panic just because one professor has left. But what are the trends? And I think the trends are scary. In particular, you've got colleges like New College of Florida, which DeSantis has orchestrated a takeover of, basically, there it will be at its most extreme. But I also think you'll see this elsewhere.
Very difficult for me to imagine an EWA higher education seminar or frankly a national seminar without a standing room only crowd waiting for you to tell us what the big stories are going to be. And when I look back at some of your prior lists, I mean, some of your stories were definitely ahead of the pack, particularly things focusing on international students and changes to policies during the Trump administration and how that was going to impact international enrollment and the bottom line for colleges and universities. I'm wondering, is there a story that has surprised you by sticking around in the top 10 list that keeps coming back year after year that you weren't expecting?
Well, I wouldn't say necessarily year after year, but big picture, I'd have to look at affirmative action. I've been covering affirmative action for a long time, and affirmative action generally was winning the case in the courts, but it was winning narrowly. And the colleges didn't truly read the writing on the wall, and they are getting hurt by the most recent decision. That decision has stuck around. Another issue would be the international students that you mentioned. That's an area where the COVID changes are still a factor, I would say, because many colleges are a little leery about admitting too many students from China and India because they don't know if they're going to get visas. And that is continuing to be a problem.
If I was a brand new higher education reporter and this was going to be my first academic year on the beat, brand new maybe even to journalism, what's your advice?
First of all, congratulations. You've got a great job, and
Thank you very much.
Join EWA and you'll learn a lot. But I would say to look at these stories from two angles. One is, what is the impact on your college or colleges that you cover in your area? And then to also look nationally, what is the big picture on affirmative action, race relations, legacies, et cetera? Because sometimes they're going to be different. And sometimes, if you only cover two colleges that are whatever they are compared to the national scene, people do find the national scene interesting. And so I would mix your coverage to both.
Are you going to miss anything about this grind, Scott?
Of course, I will miss when news happens. I still automatically think, oh, wow, what should I do? And then I have to say, oh, wait, you don't need to do that. But I'm in the third week of my retirement, so it's still an adjustment.
What are you going to be doing with yourself, keeping busy?
Well, one, I'm going to get involved in various groups as a volunteer, and I also expect to travel some. So I'll still be around, and feel free to call.
You know that I will, Scott. Thank you. Scott Jaschik has been a treasured member of the EWA Board of Directors, co-founder of Inside Higher Ed, and he took the time to join us today for this podcast. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
That wraps up another episode of EWA Radio. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.